Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. We're delighted that you're able to join us today for this side event at the 65th session of the CND on practical measures for the prohibition of arbitrary detention in drug control. I'm actually here in Vienna, and I'm here with the chair rapporteur, Elina Steinerte, of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, who has just presented her report at the 65th session of the CND just a moment ago. And we're very delighted that she was able to do this today, given that she was essentially blocked from presenting the report to the CND at the 64th reconvened session in December last year. Given that one of the key drivers globally of arbitrary detention is punitive and draconian drug policies, the urgent and concrete recommendations in the groundbreaking report of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention really has to be heard here in Vienna at the CND. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we're very, very happy that you're able to join us for this event. We have several excellent panelists lined up for you, and then we hope to have an interactive discussion and exchange at the end. Just to let you know now that we expect the event may run over by approximately 15 or 20 minutes to enable that Q&A discussion, and we hope you'll be able to stay for that. If you have any questions or comments during the event, please use the Q&A or chat functionality to ask your questions. And also, I will not be reading the long biographies of colleagues who will be speaking. That will also be shared and available in the chat for you. So we'll move straight away to opening remarks from by video address from Ms. Helen Clark, who is the chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy.
The organisation of this important event. Excellencies, the Global Commission on Drug Policy appreciates the organisation of this important event, bringing much needed attention to the issue of arbitrary detention. In total, more than 2.5 million people are incarcerated around the world for drug offences, a number which includes those imprisoned for non-violent offences, such as drug use and possession for personal use. Repressive drug policies are a significant driver of mass incarceration and of human rights violations. Those detained may suffer a range of punishments depending on the jurisdiction. These may vary from lengthy prison terms to vicious forms of corporal punishment and other ill treatment in detention, and in extremis to the death penalty. Marginalised groups are more likely to suffer disproportionate punishment. Moreover, those at the lower levels of drug offending are more likely to be detained, while organised crime kingpins so often avoid the long arm of the law. Drug-related arbitrary detention results in a continuum of human rights violations. Again, depending on the jurisdiction, there may be no fair trial. There may be interrogation of suspects when under the influence of drugs. There may be testing without consent or judicial warrant. And there may be compulsory drug treatment. Furthermore, research demonstrates that access to healthcare for those detained is often limited, in violation of the basic human right to health. For all these reasons, the work of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention is pivotal for improving existing drug policies and for making the protection and effective implementation of human rights for all a priority. The study on arbitrary detention examines various aspects of human rights compliant drug policy, showing us, for example, how intersectionality plays a significant role in arbitrary detention of members of already marginalised groups. The study also proposes a system for scrutiny by human rights mechanisms of measures taken in the name of drug prevention and control. The Global Commission on Drug Policy is calling on countries to decriminalise the use, possession, acquisition or cultivation of drugs for personal use, including the possession of associated paraphernalia. Promote evidence-based and voluntary treatment for drug dependence. Ensure the proportionality of sentencing, in particular for minor drug-related offences. To close compulsory drug detention centres and ensure that comprehensive harm reduction services are available in all detention settings. The Global Commission also joins the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention in calling on member states to release people arbitrarily detained for drug use or possession for personal use promptly, and to release persons confined against their will in drug treatment facilities immediately. A shift towards such policies would place human rights and health as central to coherent drug policies and lead to pragmatic and human rights-based approaches. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Clark. Really great to have that opening address from the Global Commission. So in the outcome document of the UN General Assembly in 2016, member states of the UN committed to promote and implement effective practical measures to uphold the prohibition of arbitrary arrest and detention in the context of drug control. At the 47th session of the Human Rights Council in 2021, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention presented their study relating to the how drug policies drive arbitrary detention throughout the world. So I now welcome Ms. Elina Steinerte, Chair of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, to highlight the findings and recommendations of this study.
Elina, your sound is not working.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
It wouldn't be a Zoom event without a little hiccup, would it? Excellencies, colleagues from the UN agencies and civil society, distinguished participants, on behalf of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, I thank all the organisers of this special event for giving the Working Group an opportunity to present its study on arbitrary detention relating to drug policies prepared by the group at the request of the Human Rights Council. The Working Group also acknowledges all contributions by the stakeholders. 21 states, 6 national human rights institutions, and 27 civil society organizations sent their written submissions to inform this study. This was followed by consultations with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the International Narcotics Control Board, as well as a virtual expert consultation. Let me now highlight some of the main findings and recommendations of the study, which aims to provide further guidance to states on practical measures to prohibit and eradicate arbitrary arrest and detention in the context of drug policies. The Working Group notes the punitive drug control laws and policies continue to be used in many states, resulting in the increasing instances of arbitrary detention in the context of drug control, with people who use drugs being particularly at risk of arbitrary detention. The Working Group also notes with particular concern the increasingly disproportionate number of women detained and imprisoned for minor drug-related crimes. The so-called war on drugs has resulted in further increase in detention for drug-related offences. Disproportionate actions by some states to apply criminalization provisions of drug control treaties or to incorporate these in their domestic legislations have frequently resulted in increased arbitrary detention. Evidence shows that the so-called war on drugs has failed to address the drug problem while also violating human rights, undercutting public health, and wasting public resources. The Working Group identified several human rights violations in this context, such as interrogating suspects under the influence of drugs and subjecting persons to testing without their consent or a judicial warrant. the overuse of and prolonged pretrial detention, and physical and psychological violence towards detainees, including withholding of substitution therapy for drug-dependent suspects. Another serious concern is the identified wide range of violation of fair trial standards for persons accused of drug-related crimes. Furthermore, disproportionate sentences for drug-related offences, often accompanied by the ban on parole or amnesty for those convicted of drug-related offences in some jurisdictions, contribute to prison overcrowding and put in question the compliance with international standards on respect for the dignity of persons deprived of their liberty. The working group also notes that the imposition of the death penalty for drug-related offences and the misuse of drug control to silence human rights defenders, journalists, and political opponents is incompatible with international standards. Any death penalty sentence following a trial that didn't meet fair trial standards would be equal to an arbitrary deprivation of liberty. Furthermore, the working group also recalled that if the legislation under which the detention took place did not meet international standards, that detention is too arbitrary. The working group emphasizes that there is a need for all drug policies to serve a necessary, proportionate, and legitimate aim, and therefore recommends that states decriminalize the use and possession of drugs for personal use, review convictions of those already detained for such acts, and expunge their records. The states are also encouraged to review procedures relating to detention, arrest, search, testing, pretrial detention, trial, and sentencing in order to address situations which enable arbitrary detention to occur. Abolishing the mandatory pretrial detention and mandatory sentencing for those convicted of minor drug-related offences to ensure alternatives to incarceration and proportionate sentencing for drug-related offences also figure prominently among the recommendations made. The working group has also observed that criminalization of drug use facilitates the deployment of criminal justice system against drug users in a discriminatory way, with law enforcement agencies often targeting minorities, people of African descent, indigenous peoples, women, persons with disabilities, persons with AIDS, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons. Homeless persons, sex workers, migrants, juveniles, the unemployed, and ex-convicts may also be thus vulnerable. The working group has therefore recommended that states address how the justice process deals with specific groups that may be the object of discrimination in order to stop their targeting. States are also encouraged to protect the rights of indigenous peoples to produce crops and plants that they have traditionally grown for their religious, medicinal, and customary purposes. States should also not take punitive action against subsistence and small-scale farmers who produce illicit crops, but should work with them to develop income for alternative agricultural crops. The study has also revealed the insufficient availability of harm reduction services and drug treatment for drug-dependent persons in detention. Only some 56 states provide opioid substitution therapy in prisons, and when provided, it may be available only to a limited percentage of inmates. The working group further found that despite the evidence in terms of the lack of effectiveness of compulsory treatment, the practice of confining people who use or who are suspected of using drugs against their will is still widespread and can and does give rise to arbitrary detention. Similarly, courts often coerce defendants with a choice between imprisonment and drug treatment. In the view of the working group, emphasis should be placed on harm reduction while addressing the social and economic vulnerabilities and follow-up. Healthcare and social care professionals should be solely responsible for the treatment of people who use drugs. The working group considers that the shift from punitive to supportive approach should be translated into making drug treatment voluntary and based on informed consent. All compulsory drug detention and treatment centers should be closed and further admissions stopped. Instead, voluntary, evidence-informed, and rights-based health and social services should be made available in the community. The working group has now turned its focus to dissemination of the study amongst the widest possible range of stakeholders and invites initiatives in supporting further dissemination and implementation of its recommendations. Firstly, as requested by the Human Rights Council in its resolution 42/22, the study has been shared with the Commission on Narcotic Drugs as the policy-making body of the United Nations with prime responsibility for drug control matters. I am pleased to inform you that today the working group was invited to present the study earlier to the Commission and its reconvened 65th session. Moreover, the working group has further intends to share this study with the International Narcotics Control Board and initiated a discussion on how to promote the implementation of recommendations through the work of the Bureau's members. The working group also plans to share the study with a wide range of regional partners, including the Horizontal Working Party on Drugs, a coordination body responsible for leading and managing the European Union Council's work on drugs, the Asian Intergovernmental Commission on Drugs and on Human Rights, and the Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy. Furthermore, the working group will streamline the recommendation in its own work during for example, its official country visit to states where drug policy debate is pertinent. In this context, the working group will encourage states to implement the relevant recommendations contained in the study. To conclude, the working group stands ready to work with all the stakeholders, including civil society, in further disseminating the study and its recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Steinerte, for that. And yes, I was in the room when the report was presented earlier, and it definitely sparked a very interesting exchange amongst several member states, several of whom pushed back against the very clear recommendations that you have just heard, but also many member states speaking out in support of having the report presented here in Vienna, and also supporting further engagement of the human rights regime here in Vienna, which is incredibly important. So the study of the working group recognizes that civil society and communities, including people who use drugs, play a significant and meaningful role in the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of drug policies. And despite their critical contribution, they are regularly victims of arbitrary detention. States must ensure that civil society and communities can work without threat, criminalization, financial penalties, or other forms of harassment. So I'm very delighted today that we have an excellent community representative, Kenya Cuevas from Mexico. Kenya is a prominent transgender activist. She was arbitrarily detained in her own country, and we will hear from Kenya how this study can help her and the community in their realization of their rights. Kenya, you have the floor.
Hola, muy buenos días a todos.
Hello, everyone. And my name is Kenya Cuevas, and I am the director and founder of Casa de las Muñecas. So I was imprisoned for 11 years. I was arrested for drug consumption. And this is part of a long legacy of discrimination of people in the community, including of myself as a sex worker. Many of us in the sex worker community overlap, and this is a way to, many times it's one of the most viable forms of work that we can engage in, to engage in sex work. However, this led to the situation where I was living on the streets for 20 years, and this is how I was able to afford my drug dependency. And so I would enter areas where drugs were sold, and one time when I did that, this is when I was arrested. They put me in prison for supposedly being in possession of several kilos of cocaine, which I never actually saw, and I never had a fair trial. This was a violation of my human rights. They also violated my right to gender identity. They didn't respect how I identify. And this was very damaging for me during my entire experience with the judicial system. Furthermore, here in Mexico, they sentenced me to 24 years. So I always defended myself. I always used all of the legal resources that I could access to defend myself, and I was able to get out after 11 years of imprisonment. And they told me, thank you for participating with us, thank you. And really, these violations of human rights that we see within prison, it's something that completely changed my life. It completely changed my view on everything. And today, upon hearing the report, this is a report that I wish had been in existence when I was imprisoned, because then maybe I wouldn't have undergone so many violations of my human rights, and especially the violence that I was subjected to, the infringement of my rights. Many different times I was also criminalized for engaging in sex work. So all of this could have been avoided if we had had this report back then. And currently, I'm part of a civil society organization that helps to defend rights, including the rights of people who are deprived of liberty and people who have been previously incarcerated. So currently at the Casa de las Muñecas, we have shelters for women. We offer comprehensive services where we're able to assist people, including in cases where harm reduction is the necessary strategy. Harm reduction is exactly what we need to be aiming towards, where we try to understand what kind of substances are being used, what is the actual situation of the person, and what is the best way forward. So I really appreciate the opportunity you've given me to speak for people who have been silenced for so long. People who are very affected by intersectionality, people who are migrants, people who are from indigenous peoples, people who are living with HIV, the intersectionality with the LGBT community, all of these examples of intersectionality. This is something that one person can be a part of all of these groups. And this makes them all the more vulnerable to having their rights violated. And then, of course, within the prison system, not having a fair chance at life. So even though I was released, completely absolved of my charges, really having been incarcerated had a massive negative impact on my life, because it's very difficult to find work, for example, if you have a criminal record. And in terms of my identity documents not respecting my gender identity, this is also a huge violation of human rights, of us being able to access our rights as people. So I really work with the population of women who have been released from prison, all of these women who are very vulnerable. We work with them to be able to reclaim their rights, to fight for their rights, to demand their rights, to have the right to life, the right to education, the right to work, the right to health. All of these rights are what we defend, and we make sure we empower women by providing them with the knowledge that they need to really understand and to be able to so that we can have an impact on people who have been who have always historically been criminalized for their drug use. And think, you know, I was a 9-year-old girl who was kicked out of her house, and I didn't know anything better. I didn't know what else to do. We don't protect these people. So I ended up with a substance use disorder. It was something that helped me not feel any more pain with the very difficult conditions that I was living in. This is something that I didn't have enough information about my rights. I didn't know about my right to express and live my truth in terms of my gender identity. So we really are working to improve the conditions of these people. And although we do have a different criminal justice system, we still see how people are criminalized for the use of substances. And we are trying to raise awareness. We're trying to say it's not the people who are working and living in the street who are the criminals here. It's the authorities who have a lot of corruption, a lot of links, and are really actually working in tandem with the drug traffickers who are selling these substances to us. These are the real criminals. And I'm also, within my community, I'm one of the most well-known leaders, most recognized. But if we didn't have our organization, what would these women do? They wouldn't have much other recourse. So we speak for the women who have been deprived of our human rights, who have been through these systems, people who have historically been deprived of their voices, who have been silenced. We are always trying to share our experience, to share our voices, share our stories of the real impact of what the criminalization of drugs does on people and we're trying to spread this message throughout the international and national levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenya. Thank you for your powerful statement, for your incredible work and your courage, and for being here with us today and sharing also some your personal experiences with us on this at this event. Thank you. So the working group on arbitrary detention study, amongst other issues, discussed various aspects of human rights, compliant with drug policy and the realization of the right to health and other economic, social, and cultural rights. The working group study took into consideration the work of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as other human rights treaty bodies. So I'm delighted that we have with us here today, Dr. Sri Nontasud, who is a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, to reflect on the findings of the study that are related to the right to health. Dr. Sri, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anne. Let me share my presentation. I'll go right away. As you are all aware, I hope, that the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is the guiding principle for the committee. And substantively, if you look at the articles, they all pertain to the issues that we are considering today: the rights of detainees from drug-related offenses, from non-discrimination to equal rights between men and women, right to work, and most importantly, the right to health that you have asked me to speak on today. Let me focus on the mandate of the committee. The committee has three mandates, like other treaty bodies. Most importantly, we monitor the implementation of the covenant through examination of periodic reports. Currently, we have 171 state parties. Then we issue concluding observations and we undertake follow-up procedures. Also very important to us is a generation of general comments. At the moment, we have 25 general comments, and number 26 is will be produced on land, number 27 on sustainable development. They are in development at the moment. And last but not least, we have our optional protocol. At the moment, there are 26 state parties, and we receive communications arising from that optional protocol. In terms of right to health, the most important principle is enshrined in Article 12, and this principle is the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. When we examine state parties' implementation of this principle, we have issue general comment number 14. And the issue of intersectionality is very important and must be underscored. In our general comment number 14, as you see on screen, paragraph 3, we say clearly that it is closely related to and dependent upon the realization of other human rights, particularly to food, housing, work, education, human dignity, life, non-discrimination, equality, prohibition against torture, very importantly. So the intersectionality is there. And we have also started discussion as well to update this particular general comment in view of the landscape change by COVID-19 pandemic. I have to highlight the issuance of this particular guidelines on the left, the guidelines on human rights and drug policy. This is very comprehensive, and I have to commend the producers of these very important guidelines. And I think they touch on every aspect of related rights. So I will not touch on the detail. I think it's a very good reference and should be disseminated most widely. What I like to say is that the important issue when we talk about detention or arbitrary detention in particular is we must remember that its meaning is here shown on screen on the right, that arbitrariness is not to be equated with against the law. I think very importantly, we must not neglect to examine the law itself, whether it is appropriate, whether it is just, whether it is predictable, and whether it is passed in due process of law itself, not just the fact that people sometimes and very often in some countries are arbitrarily detained. I think my last substantive issue and page is here on this screen. When we talk about drug policy versus human capital and human rights, right now in many countries in the world, we equate drug users as criminals and public offenders, and we must really examine this general perception. When we talk about criminalization, penalization, and detention policies for low-level crimes, and the types of drug use that should not be criminalized in the first place, we must ask the question, has criminalization and detention of drug users served the purpose of drug controls? I think the view that must be adopted is that the multi-dimensional policies taking into consideration gender, age, poverty, education, which covers not just equality, but also quality of education and awareness of people in the educational system. Also into consideration is the rehabilitation and treatment of drug users. The justice system itself is suffering from arbitrary detention of drug users, from overcrowdedness to treatment of detainees and recidivisms, and particularly as highlighted by previous speakers, the stigmatization of drug users and their records while in detention. The environment as well, we must not neglect. Use of chemicals in narcotic plant eradication, and last but not least, indigenous peoples, their rights to use drugs must be recognized as well. And this is enshrined in the covenant as well. The three questions I pose here should be points for consideration further. Number one, how sustainable are drug-related policies through the lens of the global goals? I put here just some, 9 related goals to drug and detention. The role of businesses must not be neglected either. The role of drug manufacturers and their supply chain in respecting human rights according to the United Nations Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights. And lastly, I think there must be a coherent and aligned response of the UN treaty bodies and special mechanism. I think this will be touched on by the next speaker. I leave you with 2 points. At the moment, examples in Thailand have shown that despite COVID-19, the spread of methamphetamine has not subsided. It has increased manifold, as you can see on the screen. At the moment, people in incarceration in Thailand has the number of more than 80% of the total population in the correctional system from drug-related offenses. This is very high compared with other countries. So we must also examine why people who do drugs end up in jail, many of them. My last page is this one. Thailand is the first Asian country to legalize medicinal cannabis and enter the global market. On the right, you can see that this page is from the American Kratom Association. They have advocated the use of Kratom for personal use. In Thailand, there is a move to liberalize and legalize personal use of these medicinal herbs grown mostly in the south of Thailand. So you can see that there is a dichotomy here. On the one hand, we are very stringent on methamphetamine. On the other hand, we are quite liberal when it comes to certain narcotic plant like cannabis and kratom. So I think that the next step for us is to really take into account the report by the working group on arbitrary detention and also the guidelines produced by various organizations. I end my point here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sri, and thank you also for sharing some developments on the situation in Thailand as well. So to move on, In 2018, the UN Common Position on Drug Policy was adopted. And in the report of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, they recommended states to take into account the UN System Common Position in formulating human rights compliant drug policy. Shortly after the Working Group's report was published, the UN Common Position on Incarceration was also published. This document is also squarely relevant in our discussion today. So I'm very pleased that we have today with us Philip Mesnier, who is one of the co-authors of the Common Position on Incarceration. Philip, please could you highlight how the Common Position on Incarceration and its relevance to drug policy discussions? Thank you. You have the floor.
And thank you very much, dear Anne, and all previous speakers for the kind introduction and for giving me the floor. As you have already mentioned, dear Anne, I will briefly zoom out of the specific issue of arbitrary detention in order to share with you how the United Nations have mobilized really around the issue of incarceration at large. The UN System Common Position on Incarceration, which, as you have mentioned, was endorsed in April last year, was a crucial achievement in this regard, as it for the very first time provides a joint framework for the UN to assist member states in addressing prison and associated challenges within the criminal justice context. As it secondly firmly positions prison and penal reform as an integral part of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and recognizes prisoners explicitly as a particularly vulnerable and marginalized group. And thirdly, as a position not only analyzes global prison challenges, but also describes in detail in which areas the UN commits to supporting nothing short of a paradigm shift, if I may say so, to rethink our current reliance, often over-reliance on incarceration, as well as its actual implementation. So in a nutshell, the Common Position identifies three thematic areas in which the UN intends to enhance its engagement. First of all, to shift criminal justice policies stronger towards prevention, rehabilitation, and alternatives to imprisonment. Secondly, to strengthen prison management and to improve prison conditions, obviously in line with international minimum standards, such as the Nelson Mandela rules, very importantly. And thirdly, to advance the rehabilitation and social reintegration prospects of offenders. So time is limited during today's side event, so I'll try to restrict myself to some pointers that, Anne, as you have requested, are certainly relevant for drug policies. In the analytical part of the Common Position, ample attention is being drawn to the large number of prisoners convicted for drug-related offenses worldwide. Latest data, as we have heard, point to more than 2.5 million persons, many of whom are in fact low-level offenders. And Helen Clark has mentioned in her introductory remarks that we are typically looking at the weakest link in the chain as opposed to the leaders of the drug trade. So by doing so, the Common Position truly reflects that drug policies in many countries not only are a significant driver of incarceration and prison overcrowding, but also often come along with quite a disproportionate impact on certain categories of offenders. We heard about women, we heard about marginalized groups, persons with poor socioeconomic backgrounds, etc. Not even to talk about the lack of prison-based treatment and rehabilitation programs, or more broadly, health services in prisons. So in terms of recommended actions with the Common Position on Incarceration, throughout the documents highlight the need to ensure proportionate and individualized responses to offending, as well as a need for an enhanced use of alternatives to conviction or punishment in appropriate cases. Now, obviously, this applies to all categories of offenders, but it certainly also does apply to those who are charged with or who are sentenced for minor drug-related offenses, including those related to personal consumption. So more specifically, the Common Position reiterates in this regard that the phenomenon of drug use disorders is primarily a public health concern that requires, above all, evidence-based and health-centered responses in the community, as opposed to a sort of default resort to imprisonment. As for other crimes, drug policies and sentencing practices need to carefully take into account the nature, the gravity, and the circumstances of the offense, as well as the specific background of the offender. The position makes it very clear that the UN does not support the compulsory treatment of persons with drug use disorders, which run counter to medical ethics and human rights standards, and that instead the UN will focus on increasing access to voluntary and evidence-based drug treatment and other relevant health services at community level, including in the form of non-custodial measures for offenders with drug use disorders in appropriate cases. Now, all of the above, obviously, while not neglecting that efforts are equally needed to strengthen health and treatment capacity in prison settings, where they're typically insufficient and where they're equally urgently needed, talking about the principle of equivalence of care as well as continuity of care. So we need to bring together more closely the criminal justice and health sectors of government. So as you can see from this brief rush through, if I may say so, the common position on incarceration clearly reflects content that is already embodied in international conventions, UN standards and norms, the UNGAS outcome document, previous UN common positions, including the one on international drug control policy, as well as, if I may say so, important points of the 2021 report of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, from which we have heard today. The added value of the common position being, however, that it will serve as a blueprint for incarceration-related advocacy, interagency collaboration, cooperation with civil society, as well as related technical assistance for the UN system at large. So with this brief intervention, I'd like to recommend to everybody to have a full read of the document. Please have a look. It is a very detailed and elaborate common position on incarceration. I saw that colleagues have already kindly put it into the chat box. So many thanks for your kind attention, and back to you, dear Anne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you for sharing more details on the common position on incarceration. We certainly see it as an important advocacy document, and yeah, we call on UNODC to further disseminate and highlight both the common position on incarceration and the common position on drugs. But thank you very much for being with us today. So I forgot to say thank you to all of our co-sponsors for the event at the beginning of the event today, but the list is so long that I'm not going to read it out, but it has been shared in the chat. And I'm also very delighted, therefore, to hand over to the EU permanent representative here to the UN in Vienna. The EU is a co-sponsor of this event, Ambassador Steven Clement, who will provide some closing remarks before we move to an interactive dialogue. So Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Anne. Dear participants, let me offer some additional comments for this quite extensive session. First of all, in the outcome document of the UNGAS 2016, all member states of the United Nations made, of course, commitments to respect and protect human rights in drug control. We as EU, we are particularly committed to promote and implement effective practical measures to uphold the prohibition of arbitrary arrest and detention in the context of drug control. During this side event, we have already been hearing from distinguished UN experts and representatives of the human rights community. The recommendation of the study and experts' views on the implementation of those recommendations are, of course, critical for the realization of human rights of people who use drugs, as well as fulfill our joint commitments of both the UNGAS 2016 and the 2019 Ministerial Declaration. Let me emphasize at this point several recommendations of the studies that are also in line with the EU Drug Strategy 2021 to 2025. We committed to ensure voluntary access to treatment and care services that work in close coordination and collaboration with other health and social support services, as set out in EU strategy as priority 6.1. It creates a stigma and discrimination. In its study, the UN Working Group provided a critical recommendation on decriminalization of drug use and advice to promptly release persons detained only for drug use or possession for personal use and review their convictions. The EU also supports the recommendation to immediately close state-run as well as private compulsory drug detention centers. It is absolutely critical that persons confined against their will in drug treatment should be released immediately, and drug-dependent persons should have option to seek voluntary evidence-based treatment in a community setting. Due to the limited time which is left, I will not go through all recommendations of the study. However, let me highlight a critical issue at this point: the role of civil society and community. In this side event, we've been hearing from these organizations about meaningful roles they could play in the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of drug policies. We must ensure that they can work without threats and criminalization of their activities, without financial penalties or other forms of harassment. It is particularly important in a time of horrible crisis like the one we are now witnessing in Ukraine. Let me conclude by emphasizing that we must work together in formulating human rights compliant drug policies, including the prohibition of arbitrary detention, in line with all available tools, including the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy, as recommended by the working group. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for your leadership here in Vienna on human rights and also on the participation of civil society. So before we move to the interactive dialogue, which I encourage all panelists to continue to stay on for, we'll just be showing a very short 3-minute video from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, also one of the co-organizers of this event, on the topic of arbitrary detention.
Y pues la verdad, la experiencia en la cárcel pues fue algo desagradable, ¿no? Durante 11 años vivir en un centro penitenciario donde me arrojaron en un lugar varonil, donde viví cierta serie de violencias, pero sí fue una experiencia fuerte. Pues yo considero que debería de haber alternativas de prisión y que el tema de adicciones o de sustancias psicoadictivas es un tema de salud. Sin embargo, eso se criminaliza en el país y lo único que hace el Estado es meterte a centros penitenciarios sin atender la problemática o el verdadero problema que son el consumo de sustancias.
Looking at the prison population globally, around 20% of those who are currently in prison are there for drug-related crimes, including personal use and possession. This leads to serious issues concerning the human rights protection and of course leads to overcrowding in these detention facilities, which in itself is a human rights violation.
What's really needed is for the global community to really understand that drug use is a complex medical and public health problem and should be dealt with within the health and public health system rather than the criminal justice system.
In this study, the working group calls for the closure of all state and private mandatory drug treatment facilities that hold people against their will. Drug dependency and use must not be treated as a criminal matter, but rather a health issue and addressed with rights-based measures.
So now we will move to the interactive dialogue, and we already have several interventions on behalf of co-sponsors to this event. So I will give them the floor first, and I ask them to keep their interventions to 2 minutes or less. So first we'll turn over to His Excellency Philbert Johnson, who is the ambassador of Ghana here in Vienna. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Yeah, Madam Moderator, thank you for giving Ghana the floor to make this brief intervention. First, let me thank the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights for inviting the government of Ghana to be part of this conversation. We appreciate the opportunity to add our voice to the numerous calls on the need to align drug control mechanisms with human rights obligations. The health and welfare of mankind is the main objective of the 1961 United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. Unfortunately, current drug policies in many African countries may not achieve this purpose. In West Africa has become a for drug trafficking, and the domestic consumption of drugs is also on the rise. Per projections made by UNODC, it is estimated that in the year 2020, Africa drug would rise by 40%. Yet, there are very few or no treatment or harm reduction services available in most countries. At the same time, current drug control policies make access to essential medication for pain management in Africa highly restricted. Consequently, there is a need for current drug policies in the region to be reformed to encourage prevention, harm reduction, and treatment-based networks. We all want to protect our families, friends, and loved ones from the potential harm of drugs. But if they develop a drug problem, they should be viewed as patients in need of treatment and not as criminals locked behind bars. Currently, drug policies are not achieving that goal. They are not achieving the goal to protect the health and well-being of mankind. We therefore need to focus more on the objectives of the convention by taking bold action to enable governments and health authorities counter and reduce the social and health harm that drugs cause. I'd like to make 3 suggestions. First, we must ensure that our human rights obligations and our quest to address the global drug issue are not treated in silos. Drugs are a global problem that need a global solution from an undeniable reality. Secondly, we must strengthen treatment services, especially in middle and low income countries. And lastly, we need to remove criminal sanctions for drug use. Punitive measures do not work as they put many people in prison where their drug use may worsen. Finally, let me acknowledge that drugs are infinitely more dangerous when produced and sold by criminals who do not worry about safety measures. It is therefore time for a more thoughtful health and human rights-based approach to drug. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts on practical measures for the prohibition of arbitrary detention in drug control. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And yeah, we very much support Ghana's increasingly enlightened approach to drug policy. Thank you for being with us today. So next, I will call on Mr. Pitya Dinawat, who is the advisor to the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand, another co-sponsor of this event. Tan Pitya, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Kundan, and thank you for the host organization for inviting the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand to participate in this forum. I would like to, divide my speech into 2 parts. I think that the first part is the shifting the policy from criminalization to more human rights-based policy. And the second part is my comment to the recommendation of the paper. For the first part, I think you know that Thailand drug policies, was highly under the influence of the zero tolerance of criminalization for a long time. And Thailand also operated the war on drugs during the 2003 and 2006. And also, a lot of drug traffickers and a large amount of drugs seized and arrested. But after the war on drugs, there was a clearly negative impact occurring in Thailand, and we have got a lot of negative criticism And after that, we try to review our policy by the, a collaboration of the international organization, namely the IDPC. I'm honored to name this agency, TNI, and other UN agencies like UNDP and UNODC were kindly, giving hand to Thailand. And then we try to come up with the harm reduction first. We make the harm reduction strategy as the national policy first, and after that we prepare the good strategies and approach in order to make a change from criminalization to be more human rights approach. Let me start this. We try to amend the existing drug policies and laws 5 years ago by inviting the scholars and the experienced people from various countries, and we try to learn from other country experience, especially from Central America, since at that time there was a lot of female inmates in the prison. I think we have the similar scenario in Thailand, overcrowding a prison. A lot of women were incarcerated, and then we learned that there should be a joint effort between the legislative body and even the government, and especially for the support of the CSOs. And we start to have the leading agencies. And I would like to share this experience. For instance, the national narcotic agencies of the country, who is responsible for these drug policies, and other agencies like human rights agencies, academic, courts, attorney office, something like that. And then we made a plan, the operation plan. We have a clear strategy and approach. We use the step-by-step approach, starting by creating, awareness among the target groups, and then we disseminate this information, and we focus more, on the key personnel. And after that, I think one incident that was very useful is the UNCAS, a meeting. The senior minister of Thailand and when the key personnel went to attend the UNCAS, and then we learn a lot from that meeting, especially for the more human rights drug policies, And then after we came back from UNCAS, we started to review the drug policies and law. We have the working group, and we spent, a couple of years until we can amend the drug laws. And after that, we come up with the making a new drug act code, and the new drug laws was promulgated in last year. So it takes time, for achieving drug policy from criminalization to be more human rights policy. My second passage that I would like to make a comment.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, but I have to ask you to wrap up shortly because our time is very short.
Yeah, I would like to wrap up that. I think when I read the recommendation, 16 recommendation, I think it's very practical. My comment is that you should have the leading agency, for instance, the national agencies. You should have a good strategy and approach, information, technical component, strengthen the capacity of the key agencies, the network, and then so we can move forward this recommendation into reality. Otherwise, and then we could not implement this good recommendation as well. Thank you very much, and for your time.
Thank you very much, Khop Khun Ka. So next we have, oh sorry, I have lost my list. Just bear with me a moment. So next we'll be moving to Mr. Tony Ojukwu, the Executive Secretary of the National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria, who has also been co-sponsor of this side event. So Mr. Ojukwu, you have the floor, and please do keep your remarks to 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to extend our appreciation to distinguished panelists and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and co-sponsors of this side event, and also the working group on arbitrary detention. From the standpoint of the National Human Rights Commission, I would like to add the following points as necessary measures to combat arbitrary detention. Strengthening the protective and promotional mandate of national human rights institutions through increase in the oversight and watchdog functions on drug and law enforcement agencies, through monitoring and visitation of detention and holding facilities. Currently, the National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria is embarking on audit of all detention facilities by the drug agency in the country. Secondly, by developing normative frameworks and principles, including guidelines and advisories to law and drug enforcement agencies and the judiciary. B, we have to embark on increased collaboration between the national human rights institutions and civil society organizations and other support groups of drug users for the following reasons: for effective advocacy for human rights standards and other legal protection for detainees, to calling attention to social and economic vulnerabilities and inequalities, which are key drivers in some instances to drug use. 3, enhance free legal and pro bono services to suspects on detention and trial. And then decriminalizing drug possession and personal use. This will go a long way to reducing arbitrary detention. It will also lead to decongestion of detention facilities, reducing running costs, and also reduce exposure to COVID-19 and other health challenges. Thank you once more for the opportunity to participate and co-sponsor this program, and I wish all of us very successful deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being with us. So now we have by video, I think a pre-recorded video, Jasmine Navarro-Regino, who is the director of the protection cluster of the Commission of Human Rights of the Philippines, who also co-sponsored the event. If you could have the video.
In the Philippines, the guidelines from the Dangerous Drugs Board, which establish community-based treatment and rehabilitation services, are already in accordance with that provided by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, though it must be admitted that there are issues on actual implementation. However, the voluntary nature of drug rehabilitation must be placed in the context of Philippine laws, which distinguish between those who test positive for use of drugs and those who are in possession of drugs. The former is given access to rehabilitation, but the latter are subject to penalties such as life imprisonment and fines up to 10 million pesos. Local laws highlight the prevailing national policy to pursue an intensive and unrelenting campaign against trafficking and the use of dangerous drugs. In a 2020 UNODC report, more than 45 individuals were arrested, while only 2,000 were admitted for treatment and rehabilitation. On civil society engagement, we note that non-government organizations, activists, and human rights defenders still run the risk of harassment for their activities in the drug policy field. Meanwhile, the Commission on Human Rights, as the interim national preventive mechanism, has also initiated and implemented measures to prevent torture and ill treatment in detention facilities, but potential for violations still remain high. With the prevailing state policies, the prospect of decriminalization and the primacy of a public health perspective remain a distant goal. The incumbent administration has explicitly rejected this proposal. Existing drug laws have little support for revision, and drug users are still stigmatized. To fully comply with the recommendations in the study, a radical and comprehensive overhaul of drug policies is required, which involves drastic changes in legislation, structural reform, and a massive campaign to change government perspective on the drug problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next we have Triona Lenahan, who is the Policy and International Advocacy from another one of our co-sponsors from Penal Reform International. Triona, you have the floor.
Thanks, Anne. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to welcome the study by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and thank all our colleagues at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and all the co-sponsors of today's event for this really important presentation and discussion of the study. Penal Reform International continues to support the Working Group and the dissemination and implementation of the study's recommendations in all of our work at national and international level. And the key role of civil society has already been outlined by some of the other speakers today, but we're also interested in hearing from Ms. Steinerte how the working group sees civil society's role in reform work to further the implementation of the recommendations set out in the study. And if you have any practical suggestions of how we can most effectively support and collaborate with both the UN mechanisms and national authorities towards human rights-based approaches to drug policy. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Triona. And then our last intervention from the floor, I would like to invite Galina Kornieko, who's the project coordinator of the Network of Women Who Use Drugs in Ukraine, VONA, to take the floor.
Dear colleagues, I will speak in Ukrainian, but I have translator now, and she translated me, will translate me for English. Я дуже швидко хочу наголосити на тому, що війна, яку розв'язала в Україні Росія, показала нам всі слабкі місця наркополітики та заходів з захисту прав наркозалежних людей.
I would like to emphasize very quickly that the war that Russia has waged in Ukraine has shown us all the weaknesses of drug policy and measures to protect the rights of people using drugs.
В мирний час параюристами двох національних мереж постійно фіксувались незаконні затримання людей, які вживають наркотики, незаконні обшуки, фізичне та психологічне насильство.
In peacetime, paralegals from two national networks in Ukraine have repeatedly recorded illegal detentions of people who use drugs, illegal searches, and physical and psychological violence.
Причому затримувалися в тому числі пацієнти програми ОСТ, які йшли додому після отримання законного препарату.
Moreover, patients of the OST program who go home after receiving the legal drug often get detained.
Можна довго перечисляти дані, які збирали параюристи, але я хочу наголосити найважливіше. Під час війни нормалізація в очах суспільства таких затримань та дегуманізація людей, які вживають наркотики, приводить до страшних наслідків.
I can list the data collected by paralegals for a long time, but I want to emphasize the most important thing. During the war, normalization of such detentions and dehumanization of people who use drugs in the eyes of society leads to terrible consequences.
Насильство по відношенню до людей, які лише схожі на тих, хто шукає наркотики чи робить закладки з наркотиками, наразі не рахується злочином.
Violence against people who only look like they're searching for drugs on the streets or people who stash drug packages for further distribution is not currently considered a crime.
Більш того, тих, хто шукає наркотики, люди автоматично записують в коригувальників ворожої армії і тим отримують для себе моральне право на насильство.
Moreover, people automatically consider those who search for drugs on the streets an enemy army's correctors. These people are gaining a moral right to violence.
Ми закликаємо до неухильного дотримання прав людини і припинення незаконних затримань людей, які вживають наркотики. Ми закликаємо не потурати дегуманізацію людей лише за ознакою їх діагнозу.
We call for strict abidance of human rights and an end to illegal detentions of people who use drugs. we urge not to tolerate the dehumanization of people solely on the basis of their diagnosis.
Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Galina, for your comments and for being with us today. We very much hope that you are in a safe location. And of course, we are in solidarity with you and all the people of Ukraine.
Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you. So I will now, in the minutes that we have left, I know we are running over, so thank you for staying with us. I will ask Elina, once again, Ms. Steinerte from the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention to respond to comments and questions that we have received during the discussion so far.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the very valuable contributions. I always feel difficult at these events because what the working group does really, in comparison to the testimonies that we have heard for those who have spoken today, in my humble opinion, is actually very little. But I do understand that it's very important to have this study, and it's also very important now, from the perspective of the working group, that at no point in time this is considered to be the done deal. The working group considers this only the first starting step. This is the time where real work starts. And with this in mind, the working group is very much looking forward to any stakeholders, any approaches, and stands ready to assist anyone who would like to work with working group, engage with us constructively in order to further recommendations made. The events in December when the working group was unable to present its study to the CND in Vienna, and me being here today, being able to actually do that, I think is a very important testament to how important it is that human rights are entrenched in drug policies throughout. And it would not be possible for me to be here without the support of all of you, the states, the civil society organizations, the UN agencies. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart as the chair of the working group, but also personally as a human rights lawyer. It has been a very important day for me today. I thank you for this event, and I sincerely invite all of you, the states, the civil society organizations, individuals, UN agencies, to come to the working group and involve us in your work so that we all can achieve the recommendations made in this study. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
We have the final word from Zaved Mahmoud from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who just wishes to say a final short few words in closing. So Zaved, you have the floor.
We cannot hear you, dear Zaved.
Sorry. Thank you very much to Anne and all IDPC and all co-organizers. Also, I would like to especially thank Mrs. Steinerte to come, chair of the working group, to coming to Geneva, Vienna from Geneva, and before she was traveling. And this, I hope that we will take away from this meeting that we have a lot of thing to do for the implementation of this report. And on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner, as well as all my colleagues who worked to organize this event, I would like to thank. And that was my message just to all of you. Again, big thank you. And we hope to reconvene again on this report at some point to go through the in details discussion. Each recommendation on those recommendations, how we can move forward with the support of member state, civil society, and obviously the working group for implementation. So we hope that we will have much more in-depth discussion in the future. With that note, thank you very much. And I wish all of you good evening, good morning, or good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for all of you who joined us today. At some point, we had over 100 attendees joining this side event, which I think must be a record. And really hope to see many of you together back here in Vienna, all of us next year. And now many of us will have to rush upstairs back to the plenary room where Russia is once again taking the floor, and that has really overshadowed the dynamics here in Vienna. But thank you so much, and thank you to our excellent panelists from UNODC, Kenya Cuevas, Surinon Tasud, and also Elina Steinerte for being here. We deeply appreciate it, and we know that this is really just the beginning of this important discussion, and also to say that we very much hope that more human rights experts will be doing reports on the topic of how their mandates intersect with drug policies, and will be welcomed here in Vienna to also present their work. So thank you to all of you. I wish you a good rest of your day wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.